שלום לכולם. ברשות הקהל המקומי אני אעבור לאנגלית שהיא שפת המושב הזה. Good afternoon to everyone. The plenary session that we're now going to take part in has the title Israel, Aram and Assyria, Between Bible and Archaeology. There will be five speakers as a matter of fact, and as I looked over the program and conducted an email conversation with the presenters, actually it's Israel and Aram, because we're dealing mostly with the 9th century this afternoon. But then I just heard from our first speaker that Assyria was added so that I would be chairman. So there you are. Our first speaker this afternoon is Talai Ornan, who is a senior lecturer in the departments of Archaeology and Art History here at the Hebrew University. She's a specialist on the art of the ancient Near East, focusing on religious aspects conveyed through pictorial representations. She is currently working on a publication of a hoard of second millennium bronze statuary recovered at Tel Chatzor. Her presentation will treat the relations between ancient Israel and Assyria in pre-Assyrian Iron Age II, though through an examination of Syrian and Syrianized pictorial renderings, which are depicted on local finds and which manifest Aramean and Neo-Hittite, that is, Luvian affinities. In parenthesis for everyone, we have until 5. Each presentation is a half hour. If our speakers get to the half hour, you'll have to ask your questions afterwards. If there's some time at the end of the presentation to fill up the half hour, I'll open it up for discussion. Okay, our first presentation, Dr. Talai Ornan.
שלום רב, גם אני אעבור לאנגלית על פי המצווה עלינו בכנס הזה. This lecture focuses on the connections between Israel and Syria as reflected by the inspiration of Syrian works of art on objects found in modern Israel. I will present here some of the probable Syrian motifs that are found on few rather well-known artifacts, most of which discovered in the northern part of the country. The time spent to be discussed cover the late Iron Age I and the beginning of Iron Age II, ending in the latter half of the 8th century, preceding the Assyrian domination. In accordance with the contemporary cultural historical developments of research in Syria, I will distinguish here, when possible, between Aramean sources of inspiration and Luvian ones, still referred as Neo-Hittite in many scholarly publications. Luvian art, termed after the ethnic and linguistic entity which existed in the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, is known from North Syrian and East Anatolian city-states which flourished after the fall of the Hittite Empire at the beginning of the 12th century. Iron Age Luvian art maintained to a certain degree elements of Hittite iconography and is best observed in sites such as Karkemish, Malatia Melid, and the citadel of Aleppo, Haleb. Whereas Luvian works of art are found in Iron Age I and the beginning of Iron Age II periods, recognized Aramean monuments are not yet known before the 9th century. Indeed, it was during the 9th and 8th centuries when the Arameans spread over Syria, abandoning their age-old nomad and semi-nomad way of life in favor of urban settlements. Whereas the Luvian flourished in northern Syria, and their traces are not found south of Hamat, Aramean states were spread from Tel Halaf, Gozan, and the land of Lakeh on the Habur in the east, to Bet Zamani in the vicinity of Merdin, nowadays Turkey, in the north, to Aram Damascus, bordering the northern kingdom of Israel in the south. While biblical Aram reflects the various Aramean states, the Luvians are to be identified with the biblical Hittite Chittim, alluding to the use of the term Hatti in Neo-Assyrian sources for the Syrian territories located west of the Euphrates. הכל נפלא, רק קצת קשה לראות. לי. אז אני אשתדל. Sorry, I'm sure you see it's better, but for me it's a little difficult to see what I have written. So maybe I'll do... תחבר שוב? מה? זה בסדר? Okay. Okay. I wish to begin our survey with objects that, while their source of inspiration in Syria can be located geographically, the specific entity of the people use similar objects is not clear. These pottery stands found in Tel Rehov, on which you will hear later from Professor Mazara, and Tela, situated east of the Jordan River, these are dated to the late 10th, early 9th century. In shape, they resemble clay stands found in various sites located at the middle of Euphrates region, dated to the 13th century, and thus mirror the late impact of Middle Euphrates affinities on the upper Jordan Valley. The question is whether we can associate these similarities with specific ethnic group living in the Middle Euphrates in the late Bronze, early Iron Age. It is of interest for the present discussion whether we can associate this type of artifact with semi-nomad Aramean tribes living in the Middle Euphrates in this period. Indeed, according to some scholars, the land of Kir, mentioned as origin of Aram in Amos 9:7, can be identified with the area east of Jabal el-Bishri and the Middle Euphrates. And thus, the Celtic stands from Pella and Rehov may provide us with an early manifestation of an Aramean impact in the early Iron Age II period. Sorry. Okay. Whereas, however, the shape of the Rehov and Tela stands recall that of the Middle Euphrates specimen, the imagery depicted on the two objects reflect local traditions since they reflect local traditions, since the central positioning of a schematite tree and the two nude flanking women at the sides, as we've seen in the Tel Rehov stand, are well-known motifs in the local pictorial repertoire of late Bronze canon. Two other Celtic objects whose form and decoration has long been associated with inspiration from Syrian art are the two renowned clay standards from Tanakh. The fold and some of the decor of each of the two stands are different, though, and may point to different sources of iconographical traditions. The earlier of the two, usually assigned to circa 11th, 10th century, exhibits a tiered construction comprised of superimposed 3 pairs of sphinxes and interchanging with 2 pairs of lions. In its composition, the objects clearly derived from the so-called Atlantid layout typical of Hittite art. However, as with the stands from Rehov and Pella, the tree flanked by horned animals seen on the lower facade continues local Bronze Age imagery. Also, the snake combat on the side wall manifests local trait, possibly alluding to the theme of the storm god defeating the snake, who, according to some, may stand for Mutu, death, the rival of Baal in the Ugaritic myth. Although the superimposed registers of the Ta'anach's second stand and its vertical layout recalls late Hittite compositions, the more varied imagery found on this artifact may pinpoint different, somewhat later sources of inspiration. And as in the previous examples, here too, alongside Syrian affinities, are local motifs as a tree with a standing, nibbling goats. I wish to emphasize that the tree with the standing goats does not necessarily refer to divine female images as commonly accepted, since this icon also crowns a large, yet unpublished bronze statue from Hatzor, depicting an enthroned male, which I believe should be identified with the Canaanite god Baal, represented as a divine king. Hence, it's worth mentioning that the identification usually made between the second register, showing the tree and goat, with the lower one displaying a nude female subduing 2 lions, is not self-evident, and the detail alluded to on the second register of the Ta'anach stand may stand for a male god. The theme of a woman subduing lions seen here, though, leads us back to the Syrian imagery. Indeed, the composition of a central figure holding 2 large lions, Indeed, the composition of the central figure holding 2 large lions is found on official monuments from Carchemish and Zinjirli. The theme is sculpted on the basalt monument from Carchemish, which served as a huge... Sorry, it keeps running. It should be this one. Okay? Okay, the theme here on the right, sculpted is a theme on a pedestal of a huge colossal statue of the king of Carchemish, Katuas. The statue, accompanied with the Luwian inscription, probably dates it to the late 11th, early 10th century. The similar composition, which also decorated a podium of a colossal image of a ruler, was found in Zinjirli. The clear Luwian attribution of the Carchemish statue and the probable same ascription to the uninscribed monument from Zinjirli suggest that the theme was typical of Luwian art used in representations of deified dead kings. The reappearing of the same motif among the monuments of Karatepe, Aditabatia, dated to the end of the 8th century, may corroborate the attribution of this subject matter to Luwian art. As in Carchemish and Zinjirli, here too, the composition of a heroic figure subduing lions is used on a podium of a colossal image of a king in a manner aimed at upgrading the souvenir by representing him above a heroic figure. A composition usually confined for the depictions of gods or goddesses in the ancient Near East, but not, it seems, in Luwian art. The similarity of these Syrian monuments to the stand from to the stand from Tanakh is not restricted to the... I think I'm breathing and it keeps changing. Sorry. This kind of similarity is not restricted to the theme of the subduing of animal. It is also manifested by the way the lions are depicted. In both cases, the beasts are depicted held by the frontal figure, while their bodies are shown in two-dimensional reliefs on both sides of the statues and the clay stand. However, the theme as depicted on the Tanakh differs. However, this theme differs from the However, the theme as depicted on the Tanakh stand differs in two aspects from the Luwian prototype. First, on the stage, a naked female replaces the heroic human-like or hybrid images in the center. This modification may suggest a somewhat later date of the stand, as female subduing lions are more typical from the 9th century onward. However, the second modification from the Luwian prototypes may suggest a somewhat earlier date. Whereas the subduing of lions is used in Luwian context as a means of royal propaganda aiming to elevate the ruler, on the Tanakh stand it is embedded in a religious cultic context which may imply that the making of the object predating the founding of the Israelite state in the early 9th century. With this in mind, I wish to briefly re-examine the possible source of inspiration of the winged disc surmounting the uppermost register of the stand. Although the winged disc is found in local second millennium art, mainly in glyptic imagery, it seems that the depiction of the emblem here may also be considered as originating from Syrian art. However, it is not clear whether its prototype are to be found in Luwian or in Aramean art, since, as the symbol alluding to various major deities, the icon is found on both Luwian and early Aramean imagery. For example, on a Luwian stele depicting the storm god from Tel Barsip, south of Carchemish, as well as on the Aramean style relief from Tel Khalaf. The same ambiguity is also found with regard to a fragment of another cultic stand excavated at Ir David, Jerusalem, which demonstrates that Syrian inspiration did not skip Jerusalem at the end of the 10th, beginning of the 9th century, although most of the objects bearing Syrian inspiration originate from the northern part of the country. This state of affairs not only mirrors the geographical proximity of northern Israel to Syrian territories, it also reflects, it seems, the more developed urban centers of the north. The depiction on this fragment, as suggested by Pirchia Beck, portrays the killing of Humbaba by Gilgamesh and Enkidu. To date, the only known monumental representations of the killing of Humbaba are from the Luwian or Aramean sources, since it appears at Aramean Tel Khalaf and Luwian Carchemish. Indeed, the killing of Humbaba can be regarded in this period as an international subject matter visually diffused in many areas of the ancient Near East. Its finding in Jerusalem, thus, hints to the integration of Judah within the contemporary surrounding concepts of its neighbors. I move back now to the north and wish to discuss another type of artifact, a bronze medallion discovered at Tel Dan. The object was made locally as implied by the negligent workmanship. However, the theme engraved here betrays Luwian imagery, in particular the wind goddess mounted on a bull, where wind goddesses are found on Syrian monuments echoing Hittite imagery. such as the Iron Age reliefs of En-Dara and Malatia Melid. Hittite inscriptions identify the wind goddess with a specific divine image bearing the Hurrian epithet Shaushga, meaning the Great Lady, an epithet used in relation to Ishtar during the late Hittite period in Iron Age Syria, Anatolia. The typical pictorial trait of Shaushga are her wings, an element which is not found in the depictions of Mesopotamian Ishtar. The image of the wind goddess depicted on the bronze medallion from Dan then is inspired by Luwian imagery. Even the unusual display on the Dan plaque showing the goddess standing on a bull instead of the more common display of a goddess mounted on a lion finds parallel in Luwian context, again in Malatia, on a relief accompanied by a hieroglyphic Luwian inscription. Syrian inspiration can also be traced on another very fragmentary medallion from Tel Dan depicting a banquet scene topped by a winged disk. In its composition, this second medallion from Dan parallels various steles depicting a standing person in front of a seated one with a chair loaded with food between the two figures. But as with the case of the winged disk and the killing of Humbaba, it is not possible to determine to which of the first millennium Syrian tradition we should assign this medallion from Dan. I wish to end this talk with a well-known stele found at the gate of Bethsaida on the northern eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. The stele differs from the other artifacts in the fact that it represents an official monumental work of art and not small artifacts used by private people, some possibly members of elite segments. Although the imagery of the stela relates to the worship of an Aramean moon god best represented at Haran, its unique visual traits, in particular the combination of the crescent with the bull head, diverge from the emblem of the crescent on pole typical to Haran, and implies that the monument was probably associated with an Aramean entity whose patron god could have been symbolized by both the moon and the bull. As hinted by the depiction on the stele, the deity as storm god was also typified by warlike characteristics expressed by the addition of the sword. A possible candidate suitable for this type of storm god could be Hadad Ramon, whose temple at Damascus is mentioned in Kings 2:5-18. Considering the attribution of this stele to the latter part of the 9th century or early 8th century, and the find spot of two other similar monuments in the Quran, a fourth example is kept nowadays in Gaziantep, Turkey, we may propose that these type of steles were part of the political visual propaganda by which Aram Damascus, the southernmost Aramean kingdom, was manifested. The erection of these steles in this period, I'm sorry, well, you have to remember it, it's somehow, I'll just keep on and you will remember. The erection of these steles in this period no doubt imitated the Assyrian practice of constructing standing stones and rock reliefs throughout the empire for marking and displaying the territorial expansion of Assyria. Similarly, the Bethsaida stele demonstrated the expansion and rule of Aram Damascus in the Lower Galilee during the reigns of either Hazael or Bar-Hadad, kings of Aram. Thank you. Toda.
We have some time for questions or comments.
Okay, thank you.
ודאי. עמי.
Thank you for saving me 1 minute from my lecture to show the altars. But, you mentioned the possibility of some northern traditions. Of course, we have a gap of 300 years between the altars in Syria and those that appear in Israel, the late 10th century, early 9th century. But it reminded me when I dealt with those altars, studies like those of Daniel Fleming, and maybe biblical scholars here will comment on this, that look for all kinds of North Syrian traditions, especially from the Emor documents in the Bible, even some of the laws in the Torah. And we have all those traditions about at least some of the Israelites related to this region, Haran and so on. So maybe that we have something here that we have to investigate more. But I leave it for biblical scholars and historians to discuss.
Okay.
Any further questions or comments? Thank you. Our second speaker this afternoon will be Aram Meir, who is Associate Professor at the Martin Stroes Department of the Land of Israel Studies and Archaeology at Bar-Ilan University, and co-director of the joint Bar-Ilan and Weizmann Institute of Science program in archaeological science, and he now directs the Tel El Safi Gat archaeological project. His research interests are the second and first millennium Levant, with a particular focus on the Philistines. During the second half of the 9th century, Hazael, king of Aram Damascus, was the dominant political figure in the southern Levant. Among the various military campaigns he conducted, the one to the southern coastal plain is barely known. In fact, it's only known from the biblical text in 2 Kings. Recent archaeological finds, in particular those from the excavations of Professor Meir at Tel El Safi, and the relation to the extent and nature of Hazael's campaign are the subject of his presentation this afternoon.
Good afternoon. You'll wait a second while I start the presentation. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. This afternoon, I'm going to speak about, as Professor Kogan said, about Hazael's campaign and the evidence, particularly from the excavations that we've been conducting at Tel Safi Gat. And in fact, we're just finished the last season, the 2009 season, at last Thursday. But before we deal with the campaign, we'll start with a description of the relevant finds from the site. Tel Safi is a large site, one of the largest pre-Hellenistic sites in the land of Israel, which is situated on the border between the coastal plain and the Shvela, the Judean foothills, more or less halfway between Jerusalem and Ashkelon. And it's well known as one of the 5 Pentapolis cities of the so-called Philistine Pentapolis. And as we will see, during the 9th and 10th centuries, the Iron Age 2A, it apparently is also the largest of these 5 cities. Now, the site of Tel Safi has been, and its identity has been discussed for a very long period of time. If just will stopped. Well, anyway, I'll tell you what I can tell you without what's written. For many, many years, there was a very big discussion on what the identity of the site is. And now it started. Okay. Yep. Although for the identity of the site, as suggested in the beginning, was got in the mid-19th century, from the 1920s and onwards, when Albright made the suggestion that to locate the site at Tel Rani, that was the dominant opinion for many, many years. I would say possibly for no other reason except for the fact that he was a dominant personality. And though from the 70s and onwards, both from an analysis of the biblical and extra-biblical texts, first by Rainey and then by Schneidewin, and then based on the finds from our excavation, it now seems quite sure that the identity of the site is in fact as Gat of the Philistines. And although, as I always say, we haven't found the sign, welcome to Gat, you never know. Now, as you can see from the views of the site, it's a very large and dominating site, and during the period we're dealing with, it's close to 500 dunam, as I said, one of the largest sites in the land, and it can be seen from just about anywhere in the southwestern part of the Levant. If you drive anywhere from Tel Aviv to Gaza on the coast, and you know where do you look, you can see it. If you drive anywhere from Ramallah down to Hebron, and you know where to look, you can see it as well. So it explains its role and its importance over many, many periods from the proto-historic through the modern times. Now, one of the problems with the excavation of the site is, of course, that it's covered over, for the most part, by the remains of a modern village that was abandoned in 1948 during the Israeli War of Independence. And here you can see a view of the site. I apologize for the poor quality. And by the way, maybe we shut the lights off. I'm not reading. Here we can see a view of the Tel in the 1920s. And aside from a very brief excavation in 1899 by Lisa McAllister, basically until the site was excavated by the current team, very little was known about the site. Now, the main problem, as I said, is the modern remains there. And although the Ottoman and the medieval period are very interesting periods, it's not the period that interests me. And one of the main issues that has been keeping us busy over the last decade and a half is to find areas on the site where we can excavate and reach Bronze and Iron Age levels. And basically, most of our excavation strategy has been aimed at finding those areas. And the areas that you see marked off with the blue squares are our main areas of excavations on various parts of the Tel, starting from the upper Tel over here, and more recently in the lower city as well, which I will detail further on. Now here you can see the major features, I'll skip that, and the major areas of excavation, looking from the north to the main area, Area A, which I'll be discussing in a moment, and looking from the east to west, Area E and A, the modern village, and Area F near the top of the Tel. Again, the major areas of excavation on the eastern spur, Area A, which I will be dealing with extensively, Area E, Area P. On the summit, Area F. A burial zone to the southeast. The lower city, Area D. The siege system, which I will be discussing slightly further on in the lecture. And the excavation area, C6, which relates to the siege system. And just a quick aerial view. And now, we're not going to be going through the entire stratigraphy, and as you can see, we cover a period of more or less from the early Bronze through to the modern period. What we'll be focusing on in this lecture is the Iron Age 2A, and in fact, the later part of the Iron Age 2A, the 9th century, the stratum in Area A, which was known as stratum A3, and we've found in almost every part of the site where we've excavated extensive remains of this layer. In excavations, a very, very impressive destruction level. Again, we'll expand on this in a moment. And wherever we surveyed, very, very dominant finds from this stage. And as you will see, we connect this level and its destruction with the conquest, with the siege and the conquest of Gat by Hazael of Aram Damascus. Now, most of the finds from this very impressive layer come from Area A on the eastern side of the cell, and here you can see an aerial photograph of this part of the excavation, and superimposed on it right now, this is more or less an up-to-date plan of the A3 late 9th century level, which was destroyed in the late 9th century. Yes. Now, wherever we excavated, we find these very impressive remains. And here you can see, I'm just going to zip through various finds, and you can see how they're very well preserved. Complete vessels, hundreds and hundreds of vessels, just about every type of object you can imagine, from every spectrum, every part of the spectrum of daily life, cultic vessels, and also I would call microscopic things. And one of the interesting things, which was mentioned already, I have the honor to co-direct the Bar-Ilan University Weizmann Institute of Science joint program in archaeological science, and through a wide spectrum of fields in archaeological science, we can study both the macro, but particularly the micro perspective on the finds from this and other strata. And for example, here's just a couple of perspectives that we get from in the field, whether it's through flotation, a very interesting object, which turns out was used for production of wine, and as you know, the Philistines liked wine. Or just recently, we excavated in the last couple of weeks a building from this destruction, and once we start going down, we can see collapsed roofing, and here you can see the negative imprints of the reeds that were used for the roofing, signs of burning, which through a spectroscopic analysis we can tell which parts of the houses were burnt and which were not, fallen bricks and how they fell, objects in situ. You can see here a smiling volunteer excavating one, and other perspectives. Another thing that we can see here in this destruction are evidence of both the cult but also the people who lived at the site. And in the excavation of one of the houses, we found remains of 4 or 5 skeletons of people who had been killed in the destruction. And very interestingly, these people were not buried in the destruction on the day of the conquest of the city. It turns out that these people were laying in the open air for years and possibly decades, enough time for the flesh to decompose and the bones to start to go through processes which can only happen when they're open to the air. And it seems that we have nice evidence with this and with other things of a very interesting phase of abandonment of the site, that the entire site was abandoned for perhaps decades after the destruction of the site, the conquest and the destruction of the site by Hazael. At the same time, we have various evidence of cult, both in objects, but here and there in loci which seem to be specifically oriented to cult. And this very interesting building, which has at its corner plastered niches and what seems to be a square or rectangular offering table. And on this offering table, we found a group of cultic objects which, when excavated, turned out to include a very interesting combination of a pomegranate, a ring kernos, several of these what I believe are phallic-shaped objects, and a couple of other things. And these objects were probably hanging from sort of mobile above this rectangular piece. Now, very interestingly, this room was the only room in this entire area of the excavation which was found empty. There weren't finds in it. Now, I hesitate to call this a temple because we don't have enough evidence, but I would say to give it a 100% sure identification, but there are very interesting aspects of this thing. Now, and of course, some of you may be familiar with my crazy idea about these things, and if you want to read about it, look at the article. Another interesting thing in this excavation of this level is the discovery of a bone tool workshop, something which, even though very mundane, turns out to be something that was hardly known in any other excavation in the ancient Near East. Now, when we first started doing our survey of the site, and as I said, we noticed that the 9th century pottery was predominant throughout the entire site, and it extended over an area of close to 500 dunam. And when we first published this suggestion that the site in the late 9th century was close to 500 dunam, some of the reactions of my dear colleagues was rather skeptical. And nothing like a challenge. So to prove that we can actually see remains of the size of the city, we opened up an excavation in the area of the lower city. This is the area of the upper city, which up until our excavations and survey was thought to be the extent of this site. And what we did is we simply extended it to the north of the city, between the Tel itself and the Elah River bed over here. And in area D, right at the beginning of excavation, we can see here the relationship to the upper city, to the Elah River bed. We have a fortification line which is on surface, and then right below surface we can see impressive remains of architecture. And again, right below surface we come to this same destruction layer, again with the scores and scores of vessels in situ, again representing this late 9th century destruction level. Now, who caused the destruction? And I've already given you the hint. Based on our ceramic dating of this phase, we can say it's somewhere in the second half of the 9th century. The carbon-14 dating, which now we have several dates from several different laboratories, now seems to point to the second half, but an early part of the second half of the 9th century BCE. It can be matched up with destructions at other sites which seem to be contemporary, such as at Tel Zayit. As we will pull this together, I think it can be connected with the various historical evidence that we have of the central role of Hazael and the Assyrian withdrawal from southern Syria in the second half of the 9th century. And of course, basically all we know about the campaign of Hazael to the south, to Philistia, is from the biblical text. Now in 2 Kings 12:18 in the Hebrew, we have half of a passage which before the passage goes on to discuss Hazael's campaign to Jerusalem. It's mentioned very briefly that he fought against Gat and took it. For many years there was a discussion which Gat this was. I think now with the very, very convincing evidence we can say now that this is the Gat that was captured. An interesting sidebar is in the one of the versions of the Targum Shivim, of the Septuagint, there's a mention of a slightly different version, that there was a campaign to Philistia, and Hazael took the area up to Afek. And it's not clear what that source helps us, or what's this reliability. But the bottom line is all this evidence points to identification of this destruction to Hazael, king of Aram Damascus. Now we have some very interesting additional evidence of the site. Based on the aerial photograph of the site, at the very, very beginning of the project, we noticed this very interesting feature, which I marked off here in yellow lines, which surrounds the site on the eastern, southern, and western side. And here you can see it marked off in the plan as well. And it was clear immediately that this was a siege system. And for the last 10 or so years, we've been excavating and surveying this, and now we have a clear picture of what we have here. This is a trench, and here you can see the trench, part of it excavated, and the material that was poured out of the trench, always on the side away from the city. And if you look inside the trench, you can see it's dug out in bedrock, or rather quarried out in bedrock, about 8 meters wide on the top, about 4 at the bottom, about 4 or 5 at least deep. And you can see here that it's refilled. First there's a post-siege Iron Age II refill, and then a Byzantine period refill. But very interestingly, at the bottom of the refill material, apparently material that rolled down from the top from when the trench was still open, and there was a berm here, all the material that eventually rolled back in. We have several basically restorable vessels which seem to have been articulated before they fell out, and some of them have some, I would say, intriguing parallels with material coming from northern Syria, from the Aramean, or I wouldn't say northern Syria, Syria and the north. And this, though, requires further research. If already we're mentioning the possibility of Aramean evidence here, if we do have a siege, the question, of course, is can we point out to Aramean evidence on site? And I must say, first of all, so far not so much. The only possible parallel is a few broken stone objects which were found in Bliss and McAllister's excavation, unfortunately in a very, very unclear context. And for many, many years they were discussed in the literature as possible Assyrian reliefs. Recently I re-examined them after spending quite a long time looking for them in the Rockefeller Museum. And I think it can be securely said, and I thank Talai for her help on this, that this seems more like something of an Aramean or Neo-Hittite type of iconography. And it was just published in the New Eretz Israel. Now here's a reconstruction of what this trench looks like. And here you can see the trench, the berm, what we assume is where the fortification, and of course the city coming over here. And again, this would give you a representation of the extent of the city, of the siege trench and the berm, the siege towers that have been found around it, and it would seem that this is a full-fledged siege system, which again, if we want a comparison, at least from a functional point of view, the best comparison that is well known would be the circumvallation at Masada. Now, the idea being here is to close the people in, not let them escape, not let them get supplies, but also to make it difficult for them to attack the besiegers, because the besiegers in a siege would be situated in open ground and very, very easy to attack. And this is a method of siege which is very uncommon, particularly in antiquity, before the invention of gunpowder, and we only have a few examples of this. Now, the dating of this siege system, which we can date very, very securely to the 9th century as well, puts it as the earliest known siege system that we have in the world. That's from an archaeological point of view. Although there are mentions of sieges in historical documents from before, the actual evidence of a siege, this is the earliest evidence that we have. And it's about 2 kilometers long, about 5 meters deep, 8 meters wide, roughly about 60,000 cubic meters of earth or stone which were quarried out, which again, a very rough estimate would take about 5,000 people, about 3 to 4 months. Add to that the people defending them, the people supplying them, the people fixing their tools, etc., etc. This is a large group, and I think only a very major force and a very substantial polity could have the logistic capabilities for such an action. And with all due respect to the Israelite kingdom, the Judean kingdom, the other Philistine cities, the Ammonites, whoever, this is not them. I think the only 2 possible candidates are, one, the Assyrians, and there are no Assyrian finds, and there's no evidence of the Assyrian activity in this area in the late 9th century, in the second half of the 9th century, and I think this leaves really only the Arameans as we will go on. And here's a just finished, slightly humoristic, artistic reconstruction of what the siege might have looked like. Again, this is viewed from the side of the besiegers with the Gat, the fortified city, up over here, and here you can see the berm, the trench, one of the towers, and a couple of overweight Aramean soldiers. Now, if we have the eastern, southern, and western side, what about the north? Clearly, it wouldn't be worth anything without the north enclosed as well. And we assume that what the Arameans did is that they simply tied up to the existing trench, the natural river bed that runs along the north. And you can see it here. We have this side. The question is, what about the north? And of course, in an area that was checked using ground-penetrating radar, we managed to discover the continuation of the trench beyond the area that was seen from the air, and we could show quite clearly that we have a continuation along the east to the northern side, and we can, I would say, confidently say that we have this full enclosure around the site. Now, perhaps the smoking gun, if we use a modern term, that helps us put this in Aramean context is from the Zakur inscription. In the well-known Zakur inscription found in the early 20th century in northern Syria, Zakur, the king of Hamat and Lash, among other things, tells us how Baal Shamin, the Aramean god, saved him from the siege that Bir-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the same Hazael that we're mentioning, conducted against the city of Hadrach somewhere in the very, very early 8th century. And in line 10, he tells us that they raised a wall higher than the wall of Chazrach. They dug a ditch deeper than its ditch. And as I've discussed in an article in the Stegerfestrif, I think that this can be confidently identified as a similar method of siege as we have on the ground at Tel Safi and here in this inscription, and suggestions to see the charitz as some sort of tunneling, as Professor Ifal suggested, I don't think withstand scrutiny. So here we have the Aramean method of siege, if you want, mentioned in the early 8th in the Zakur inscription, and on the ground a couple of decades earlier at Tel Safi Gat. Now, after the destruction of Stratum A3, late 9th century, Tel Safi goes through a big change. Gat of the Philistines is no longer an important site. It's not mentioned as a major Philistine site from this point onwards. And in fact, after a period of abandonment, and then perhaps evidence, which we're still checking, of an earthquake, there's a resettlement in the late 8th century, and the site changes. And if in the previous strata the site is of a Philistine coastal cultural orientation, from this point onwards it moves to a Judean orientation. And then two brief strata representing the late 8th century, we have various evidence of Judean culture, whether it's architecture, and we suggest that perhaps these two phases are the westward expansion of the Judean kingdom in the late 8th century, in the reign of Hezekiah, and perhaps the two destructions are one by Sargon and one by Sennacherib. And here you can see various examples of the distinctly Judean finds that you have on site after this destruction. And afterwards, the site is abandoned until the Persian period. Now, how can all this evidence be related to the reign of Hazael? Now, we don't know too much about Aram Damascus. I can show you some nice aerial photos of what probably was the location of the palace of Hazael. But really, Hazael is not known from the archaeological evidence in Syria, but rather he's well known from the Assyrian sources, from Aramaic inscriptions, from the extensive biblical descriptions of historical events relating to Hazael. And it's clear that in the second half of the 9th century, after he came to power, and in light of a long period of Assyrian, if you want to call it withdrawal from this region, he was the main player. He was the neighborhood bully. And he figured very, very centrally in the Levantine geopolitics. And we know very well of his campaigns, particularly from the biblical texts in the Kingdom of Israel and Transjordan. But there's a lot of other evidence that seem to indicate that he was active in other places. And here we have the ivory inlays mentioning his name, and the horse cheek guard from Samos, all indicating a very, very dominant personality. And of course, we have the Royal Aramaic inscription from Tel Dan, which most people, there are a couple of exceptions, attribute this to Hazael. And of course, the discussion of how does he relate to the rise of power of Yehu, etc. And I just want to suggest a little thing, which you'll excuse me if I'm being a little bold. How about that? Who knows? Now, you'll say I'm crazy, but since this is such a a major event, and as I'll speak about this in a moment, had enormous political consequences throughout the southern Levant, it might very well be that this is mentioned in this stela as well. Now we want to try to put this within a chronological context. We know very well that Shalmaneser III, in addition to receiving tribute from Yehu, as we see in the Black Obelisk, the same year as Hazael came to power, he campaigned to Damascus. A few years later, that's his campaign to Damascus. A few years later, we know that he again campaigned in Damascus, but we know that the last campaigns of Hazael, of Shalmaneser III to southern Syria were two campaigns in 838 and 837. After that, all known activity are in the north. And thus, if we want to start attempting to place where the campaign in Philistia could be, I think we have several options. Notice that it has to be somewhere between, and I'm using here Rainey and Notley's chronology. Of course, you can take another one and move things a little forward or backwards. It doesn't really matter by just a few years. But it has to be somewhere from 841, where he came to power, to somewhere in the very late 9th or early 8th. And it's usually assumed that it has to be after the campaigns to Damascus. Now, for many years, the accepted... Oh, no, I don't want that one. The accepted interpretation was placing it somewhere about between 820 and 810. And the argument was that it could only occur, the campaign to Philistia, after the end of Shalmaneser III's reign, in the reign of Shamshi-Adad V, since the Assyrians were much weaker then. Another suggestion that has been recently put forward by Rainey has been to place it in the very beginning of the 8th century, and right before Adad-Nirari III's campaign to Damascus in 796. Now, I would like to argue that perhaps we're looking too late, and I think perhaps we should place it over here. And why do I argue this? For several reasons. First of all, the carbon-14 dating that we have, and now we have several good dates from this stratum, indicate that we're not dealing with the end of the 9th or the early 8th, but we're well in the middle or towards the middle of the 9th century. And clearly, it couldn't be when the Assyrians were still active in the Damascus area, so there's no reason to not to say that it couldn't be after, just a little time after the the last campaign of Shalmaneser III to Damascus. An additional point, which I think nobody's noticed, and I think is perhaps an important point, is perhaps it was also carried out right after the rise of Joash. And it could very well be that Joash, as a child king, was seen as a possible weak link in the chain, and perhaps Hazael thought this was an opportunity to campaign to Judah. Now, to reiterate the main points. Gath of the Philistines was destroyed by Hazael in the second half of the 9th century as part of a campaign to the southern coastal plain in Judah. Other sites, such as Tel Zayit and others, were also destroyed at this time. The campaign may be an attempt by Hazael to control the route to Egypt and routes from Arabia to the Mediterranean, just as his campaigns to other parts of the southern Levite were aimed at controlling strategic points and routes, such as campaigns in Transjordan. The unique siege system, earliest known in the world, can be paralleled with a description of the Aramean siege in Zakur inscription. This event was a major geopolitical event, a political watershed for the land of Israel at the time, perhaps inter alia, enabling the expansion of the Judahite kingdom in the late 9th century. Following the destruction, Gath of the Philistine loses its role as a dominant polity in Philistia, and when settled again briefly in the late 8th century is under Judean control. As opposed to previous suggested dates for this campaign, an early date, around 835 and later, right after the last campaigns of Shalmaneser III to Damascus, is suggested, perhaps in an attempt to utilize the perceived weakness of Judah due to the reign of a child in Jerusalem. This early date is supported by the carbon-14 dates. As I said, perhaps this major event is even mentioned in the Dan Stela. I'm finishing. And all that's left is to hope, inshallah, that we'll find the inscription from Tel Safi. And finally, you're all invited to join us, and we have a major project looking for people to join in various aspects in our excavation. And thank you very much.
From the northern Shfela, we'll now move up to the Galilee. And our next speaker is Professor Amichai Mazar from the Institute of Archaeology here at the Hebrew University. His research interests include the Bronze Age and Iron Age and the relationship between archaeology and biblical history. His current projects are at Tel Bet Sha'an, the publication project, and at Tel Rechov, excavation and publication. 17 years of archaeological investigations at Tel Bet Sha'an and Tel Rechov, the two major sites in the Bet Sha'an Valley, revealed important new evidence on many aspects of local Israelite material culture, as well as the impact of Aramean and Assyrian conquest during the period of the late 9th and the 8th centuries. And Professor Mazar's lectures this afternoon will survey some of these discoveries and explore their historical significance.
Professor Kogan, ladies and gentlemen, in light of the current, can you hear me? In light of the current uncertainties and debates concerning the history of Israel in biblical times, archaeology became an essential source for new data which is directly relating to the controversial periods and issues. Indeed, archaeology can throw light on both long-term processes like social and economic changes, as well as on short-term historical events such as warfare and destruction of cities. Yet in both cases, we face silent evidence of material culture remains, which in many cases can be interpreted in various ways. Today, I tend to speak on three such examples, stemming from the long-term excavations at the site of Tel Bet Sha'an and Tel Rechov in the Bet Sha'an Valley, which I have conducted since 1989. I assume we need a PowerPoint. Without this, archaeology can't work. Well, first, the question of ethnic identity, namely assigning ethnic tags to material culture assemblages. This issue is difficult in particular when dealing with transition periods and periods of historical uncertainties, such as the 10th and 9th centuries in the northern valleys of Israel. What was the self-identity of the people whose houses and industries we dig? Did they consider themselves Israelites, Canaanites, or just belonging to local lineages, living for generations in their own cities? A related issue is that of their religion. Did they worship Yahweh, or were they still worshippers of Baal and other Canaanite deities? Second, the question of the agents of destructions. Can we identify securely the causes of destruction layers in our excavations? Third, the question of chronology and its implication on utilizing archaeology for historical reconstruction. When we deal with the 10th and 9th centuries in Israel, we face the particular controversy over the Iron Age chronology, which has direct implications on the debated issues of the historicity of the United Monarchy of David and Solomon. Not always can archaeology provide clear answers and solutions to such questions. We will meet all three ethnic groups which were defined, perhaps only two, according to the clock, groups which were defined in the title of this session, Israelites, Arameans, and Assyrians. But we must add to those the local Canaanite population. Let us recall the biblical account. Here you can see the site of the location of Bet Sha'an and Tel Rechov, of course known to all of you, in the Jordan Valley. Tel Bet Sha'an, Tel Rechov, the largest mound in this valley, 10 hectares in area. And of course, the biblical account in Judges 1, verse 27, and Joshua 17, according to which the Bet She'an and Jezreel valleys, as well as the parts of the coastal plain, were not inherited by the tribe of Manasseh, and local Canaanites continued to reside in these regions. This textual account can be supported by our excavations at Bet She'an and Tel Rehov, where Canaanite cities indeed flourished during the 12th, 11th centuries BCE. At Rehov in particular, we could follow, in those sections, especially here, in this section, we could follow continuity of the local Canaanite city from the late Bronze Age until the end of the Iron Age I in the late 11th or early 10th centuries, in spite of various changes and rebuilding. The same situation is known from other sites in the region, such as Megiddo, Yokneam, Dor, Akko, and Tel Kesan. The question is, what happened to the Canaanite population of the valleys in the transition to the Iron Age II? Was it replaced by the Israelite families, Was it amalgamated with the Israelite families who arrived from the hill country? Did it retain its own identity in spite of being part of the geopolitical entity of the Israelite state? All these possibilities should be taken into account when evaluating the archaeological data. Alternative scenarios can be suggested, and indeed, during the 10th and 9th centuries, we can observe variations between various sites. Even Bet She'an and Rehov differ from one another in the details. I will now present very shortly the results of our excavations at Rehov and Bet She'an relating to this period. We shall do it with pictures and very fast. Usually it takes me an hour and a half, so 10 minutes, just a short review. You can see here large buildings that we exposed on Tel Bet She'an. They were in a very bad state of preservation. They were excavated already, mostly by the University of Pennsylvania 60 years ago. But they are massive buildings, and they are dated to this particular period. When I say this period, I mean Iron Age 2A in archaeological terminology. The problem is that according to all of us, and on this we have no debate, it is very, very difficult to distinguish between the 10th and 9th centuries. Only very lately now we start to learn to differentiate between these two centuries, and it will take time. More research is needed. So the pottery that we find in these particular buildings can be dated either to the 10th or to the 9th. They are massive buildings, and they are probably related and are part of a much larger complex, which you can see here, a very well-planned town, as you can see on this plan. But Tel Rehov is indeed the most important site, I think, in northern Israel relating to the 10th and 9th centuries BC. In this site, we excavated large areas, all dated to this particular period. The reason is that in the lower city, about 5 hectares of the lower city of Tel Rehov were completely destroyed during the 9th century BC, just like at Tel Tzafit, and probably by the same agent. And there was no activity after that. That means when we dig here, after 2 inches of excavations, we find ourselves in 9th century BC buildings well preserved. And what we see here in these large areas that were excavated by us is a very peculiar and unusual picture. A whole city built of mud bricks without stone foundations, very, very unusual in Iron Age architecture of this country. In many places we find wood as foundations for walls and floors, also a unique feature. And we have the plan. These are 3 plans that are showing you the earliest city, 10th century BC, according to radiocarbon dates. The green city, stratum 5. This is stratum 6, stratum 5, the green city, according to radiocarbon dates, late 10th century, early 9th century BC. And the blue city, which you can see here, this is the one that was finally destroyed and abandoned, according to radiocarbon dates, 9th century, no later than 840 or 830 BC. That means exactly the date that we heard just now from Aaron Meir at Tel Tzafit. So we have here 3 well-planned cities. What you see here is just one area, our main area of excavation, Area C. Very well-planned city, densely built throughout this period. In fact, if we dig below this red city, we shall find ourselves in the Iron Age I, in the 11th century BC. And again, we shall find very well-planned city, as our small trenches indicated. So the word here is continuity. We have a continuity of urban life throughout this period, from the 11th through the 10th, into the 9th century, until this final destruction and abandonment of at least half of this city. You can see examples of this unique architecture, very well planned mud brick, very well preserved mud brick walls. here are a few examples. You can see the ovens that are well preserved and so on. The Green City, Stratum 5, is unique in having, in one area, this unique discovery, the apiary, the beehives, which are the only ones found so far in archaeology, anywhere. This is an industrial apiary dated to the late 10th or early 9th century BC. It was already published, and you can see how we discovered it. I don't have the time to discuss it in detail. You can see the reconstruction. I'm sorry, almost can't see a thing. But you can see the beehives here and here. Of course, a nice illustration, if you want, to the famous biblical idiom, a land flown with milk and honey. Those beehives are based on tradition that is well known to us in Egypt back to the 3rd millennium BC, but unknown to us anywhere else in the ancient Near East from archaeology. But this tradition, as we know, continues all the way to our own age, as you can see in this one example out of many of ethnographic examples for such beehives in modern Near East. The Green City, this Green City was destroyed, but it was not a total destruction. In fact, only the area of the beehives, this area, was burned heavily. Other buildings were rebuilt and changed, and as you can see in this picture, in the 9th century, the Blue City, a new building was built here on top of the beehives, but other buildings were just reconstructed, rebuilt, and continued until their final destruction by the mid-9th century. From the 9th century, we also can show a nice sanctuary, an open-air sanctuary with a large courtyard, platform, standing stones, and probably a building used maybe by the priests behind this courtyard. All this is very, very different from what we know from other Israelite cities. If we look on Chatzor, Megiddo, Tel El-Farah, Shechem, anywhere in Israel, we shall see pillared buildings, pillared stone architecture. This is the hallmark of Israelite architecture. This is not the situation at Tel Rehov. Tel Rehov looks very much different, looks foreign in terms of architecture. As to the material culture, we have here very rich, enormous quantities of finds, especially from the final phase from destruction in the 9th century BC. All this red slipped and burnished pottery, which is a hallmark of the 10th century and 9th centuries BC. You can see it here, the typical hand-burnished pottery. There were scholars who called Solomon the red slip king. So here you can see the typical red slip pottery of this age. Of course, we cannot assign it any definite address in terms of historical figures, but it's definitely typical to this period. But we also have a lot of continuity of Canaanite traditions. The painted pottery, which is so characteristic to the Canaanite pottery, of the 11th, 12th, and 11th centuries, still continues to some extent. A kind of debased forms like this tree and so on are still known. The altars, which Talai Ornan mentioned, are very typical to Tel Rehov. We have now fragments of more than 14 such altars, and they are a kind of, I would say, a typical cult object in this site. Again, almost unknown elsewhere. The two that were found at Pela, at Pechal are very similar. They are in the same region, just 7 kilometers away. But other than that, we almost don't know those horned altars. And again, Talai already discussed them. You can see new examples that were found just last year, typical to this period. And of course, already you heard about this interesting, unusual parallel at the area of Meskene Emar on the northern Euphrates, dated to about 300 years earlier in the 13th century. And there is a big question, of course, whether these two can be connected. And this subject already was discussed. Other cult objects from Rehov are unique objects like this last example of a pottery shrine that is well known to us from the late Bronze Age and Iron Age 1. Here is the last example, but the iconography on it that you can see here is very unusual and still unexplained. Rich variety of clay figurines indicate again Canaanite traditions. This is the largest collection of the female goddess playing the drum. We have here more than 8 examples of this one. We have a large collection of seals just published in the last volume of Eretz Israel, seals and seal impressions. Again, they are important because they give us a clue for how the glyptics of this period looked like. For example, there is no one example of inscribed seal from this period. That means all the inscribed seals that were attempted to be dated to the 9th century. For example, the seal of Izebel, which became famous recently, probably are 8th century. We have no examples for inscribed seals anywhere, either at Rehov or any other site from the 9th century BC. But we have also local style of glyptic, like this one, on seal, on jar handles, which probably show, in my view, a god standing on hills, on mountains. Very schematic and very simple. Perhaps these were wooden seals that were used, but it's interesting because it may indicate the worship of Baal if we accept this identification. And a very interesting object is this ivory piece showing a male sitting on a throne, unfortunately very much broken, resembling a relief, an ivory relief found at Samaria, showing again probably a king sitting on his throne. This is 9th century, this is the time of the Omride dynasty, and perhaps we can see here a depiction of the king, maybe the king of Israel, sitting on his throne in a very, very unusual piece of art. We have no parallels to this piece where the head, hands, and legs were made separately and attached to the main body of this little statuette. We also have good evidence for trade relations, especially in the last two phases, 5 and 4, not in the earliest one, I must say. The earliest one, the red city, level 6, has no evidence for international trade, but in the two other levels, 5 and 6 and 4, we have good evidence for trade, especially with Phoenicia. Phoenician pottery, like this unusual jar that you see here, in fact, it is unique, probably came from Tyre or Sidon, but also Cypriot pottery, as you can see here. We have a lot of examples of Cypriot pottery, and even few interesting shards that came from Greece, from the island of Euboea in eastern Greece, a very unusual feature in the land of Israel. Probably they came through Tyre, where such pottery was found, evidence for relations with, the earliest relations with Greece in the late 10th or the 9th century BC for sure, important for dating the Greek Iron Age. Finally, a few words about inscriptions. We have several very short inscriptions from the 9th century. As you know, inscriptions in the 9th century are very rare in this country. We have few inscriptions, Hebrew inscriptions from this period. And here we have several incisions on jars, one of them saying Leshak, perhaps Yud, though this is a very unusual, again unique sign. It could be read as a Yud, so in that case it should be Leshakia. Nimshi, Nun Mem Shin. Nimshi is well known to you as once a father, once the grandfather of Jehu in the Bible. He is known to us also from another inscription that is not illustrated here, from another jar found together with the beehives in our level 5. And he is also known from a jar found at Tel Amal, near the Sachne Springs, just a few kilometers west of Tel Rehov. So we have 3 times the name Nimshi in this area, in this region. And I just asked myself whether the family of Jehu, perhaps, if this is the family of Jehu, if Jehu didn't came from this particular region and family. This is a question that should be considered. Now, what can we learn from all this on biblical history or event history and so on? Tel Rehov, with its 10-hectare city, densely built, is one of the largest Iron Age sites in Israel relating to the 10th, 9th centuries. As I said, here we can see, I must skip some of this material. Excuse me for a moment, yeah. In terms of geopolitical okay, in light of the current varied and disputed views concerning the historicity of the United Monarchy, any interpretation of the evidence from our excavations would remain insecure and debatable. I just want to mention that in my view, we should not throw into the wastebasket the entire biblical narrative concerning this state. A limited state with its capital in Jerusalem could include, in my view, the regions mentioned, at least as parts of Solomon's administrative districts in Kings 4. The 5th districts include Ta'anach, Megiddo, all Bet She'an, which is at Tzartan below Jezreel, from Bet She'an to Abel Mecholah, as far as the other side of the Yokmeam. If you look on this map, here is the 5th region. We have also interesting evidence for the historicity of this list from the region of the Sorek Valley, where we have 2 inscriptions, now 3 inscriptions mentioning the name Hanan, maybe related to Elon Bet Hanan in this region. So, in my view, this list should be taken seriously. And perhaps what we see at Bet She'an, those massive buildings that we saw at Bet She'an, and the early Iron 2A city that we saw at Rehov in the 10th century BC, should be related to this list and to this situation in the 10th century BC. Let us turn now to the question of destructions. We have at Tel Rehov a series of destructions, of heavy destructions. One of them, as I said, is the destruction layer that put an end to the apiary, to the Green City, the 5th stratum 5. Part of the city was destroyed heavily, other parts were continued in use. Then the Blue City, level 4, was heavily destroyed, as I said, at the end of towards the middle of the 9th century, a little bit, somewhat later than the mid of the 9th century BC, according to the radiocarbon dates, not later than 840 BC. Who were the agents of this destruction? One possibility, which we should take into account, is Shoshenq. Shoshenq mentions in his list in Karnak, he mentions both Rehov and Bet She'an, and the term Ha'emek, the valley. Now, the radiocarbon dates, Tel Rehov yielded the most, I would say the best series of radiocarbon dates, more than 62 radiocarbon dates from well-stratified contexts. And you can see here this development from the 12th century all the way to the 9th century. The dates from stratum 5, published in this book, The Bible and Radiocarbon Dating 2005, with a picture of Shoshenq on the cover, is, as you can see here, this red line marks the 900 year, the green line 1000, and the yellow 800. And you can see that all the dates from stratum 5 are at the end of the last quarter of the 10th century BC, which could fit very well a conquest of this place by Shoshenq. Most of these samples were taken right from this destruction layer where the apiaries were located. But of course, we cannot be sure, because radiocarbon dates has quite a range. It could be a little bit later, it could be a little bit earlier, and there is a debate among scholars whether Shoshenq indeed destroyed cities in this country or just passed through the country and didn't really destroy city after city as we usually think. Anyway, in 2003, in our publication in Science, we suggested that Shoshenq is the agent of this particular destruction. I still think that this is a possibility, though I cannot be sure. The final destruction of the city, that of stratum 4, as we can see here, was dramatic. We can see huge destruction layers everywhere. Each one of the houses was burnt heavily. As I said, the date, the radiocarbon date, is no later than 840, and it's very much possible to relate this destruction to one of the events that occurred after the end of the Omrite dynasty, either during the time of Yehoram, son of Ahab, or during the beginning, the early years of Jehu, the founder of the new dynasty. It could be Hazael, though we don't have a very nice biblical verse like Aaron Meir has forgot, mentioning that Hazael destroyed Rehov. In fact, Rehov is not mentioned in the Bible at all. But this is a possibility that should be taken into account, and so we published it. But we have to take into consideration also other possibilities. For example, Shalmaneser III, who perhaps passed through this region, if the identification of Mount Carmel in his inscription is correct. It could be also the events that were related to Jehu's revolt and coup around 840 BC. I still believe that the Aramean address for this destruction is the most probable one. If we have 5 minutes more, will you give me 5 minutes? I'll show you a few maybe highlights from the later period. After, I skip Bet She'an, and this is a destruction, the 8th century destruction by Tiglat-Pileser III of Bet She'an, which was very clear. But I return to Rehov. At Rehov, the destruction of the city, of the 9th century city, was severe. But during the 8th century BC, we can see a revival of the upper city alone. Only this part of the mound was rebuilt, and now it was surrounded. You can see all these areas were abandoned. All this lower city was abandoned. But the upper city was now surrounded by a massive, thick, 9 meters wide mud brick city wall, which now defended the city and probably was intended to protect the city against the new aim, the battering rams and the siege machines of the Assyrian armies. This is the 8th century, and indeed the city was destroyed heavily. We can see heavy destruction with skeletons, just as Aaron showed us at Tel Tzafit from the 9th century. Here we have it in the 8th century, skeletons of people that were slaughtered in their houses and left as they are to be buried under the collapsed walls and so on, never to be buried. The material culture is typical to the 8th century, iron 2B, there is no debate about that. What happened after the destruction? The city was abandoned, but we have evidence for some Assyrian activity on the site in the form of burials that we found in various excavation areas. We have them in 3 areas now, Area A and Area B. In these 2 areas, Area B and Area A, we have about 5 Assyrian burials, all accompanied by Assyrian pottery. You can see these typical Assyrian-shaped bottles. One of these graves, this burial, 8200, is of particular interest. We found it near the city wall, south of the city wall. On top of the city walls, there was the ruined city walls. There was some evidence for squatters, for some activity. And this burial of a male was accompanied by a unique group of finds. First, there was a large iron sword, one of the few large iron swords, 75 centimeters long, that was found in this country. We found his dagger. We found his fibula. We found his personal bowl or cup made of bronze, all in Assyrian shape. This bottle and this bowl are typical Assyrian. But he also had some precious materials like many beads and cosmetic bottles brought from Phoenicia and Cyprus. The most interesting point in this burial was this vessel. This is a jug that all of us know very well, those who dig at Judah. It is very typical to Jerusalem, Lachish, and Judea in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the Judean decanter. And on top of its shoulder here, we have this incision, which is so characteristic to Judean vessels. We have 4 or 5 examples like this at Beersheba, at Lachish, and Jerusalem, and other sites. So here we have an Assyrian soldier, perhaps, that was buried, according to the physical anthropologist, Professor Hershkovitz. His skull is not local. It's a kind of Armenoid skull, a guy that came somewhere from the Caucasus, perhaps. He probably fought in Judah, and somehow this particular jug from Judah came to be found in his burial at Tel Rehov in the late 8th century BC. On his chest, we found this seal, and this is the end of this particular talk, the seal of a guy called Ali Am. It will be published by Professor Achituv, who thinks that the meaning of the name, this is a unique name, unknown to us from the Bible or from any other West Semitic inscription. Maybe he thinks the child of his mother, something of this sort, with the winged sun disk. Was it the name of the owner, of the man who was buried here? Or was this seal also a kind of something that was looted and brought by him from Judah or from somewhere else in Israel? This is a question that is left for you to discuss. Thank you.
After seeing these sites in in the south, in Judea, or in the border in Philistia, and now in the Bet-Shan Valley, our final talk this afternoon will deal with fortifications, a way of looking at the material through excavations and perhaps also through the text. Our two speakers this afternoon in this paper, Doron Ben-Ami and Nili Vazana. Dr. Doron Ben-Ami has been a senior member of the Chatzor excavation during the past 15 years and is currently directing a large-scale excavation project in the city of David. He teaches at the Institute of Archaeology at the Hebrew University. Dr. Nili Vazana is chairperson of the Department of Bible and a member of the Department of History of the Jewish People at the university. The two scholars have collaborated during the past 3 years, teaching a course which dealt with issues of Bible, archaeology, and history. Their paper treats two aspects of the phenomenon of Iron Age II fortifications in Israel and Judah. The first, the reason for these fortifications, that is, the identification of the enemy at the gates. The second aspect, the period when these fortification systems were inaugurated. The question of chronology is clearly tied to the question of early urbanism in monarchic Israel, which in recent years has become the focus of a very heated controversy. Therefore, their discussion of the dating of the fortification systems carries important consequences for this debate over the chronology of the Iron Age. Dr. Vazana.
Thank you very much, Professor Kogan. This paper, is a result of the joint work of Dr. Doron Ben-Ami and myself, the fruit of the interdisciplinary course we have been teaching for the past 3 years for students of Bible, archaeology, and the history of the Jewish people, some of which are here. We hope to show how a joint effort of scholars from different disciplines may provide a new look on both old and new questions, in this case on the phenomenon of fortifications in Iron Age Israel and Judah. The revival of urban life in Israel during the Iron Age was connected to the appearance of fortifications as an integral aspect of the emergence of cities. Some of the early cities, such as Chatzor 10, were planned and constructed with fortifications at their initial phase. In this early phase, the few fortifications are mostly casement walls. Other sites had an unfortified phase, in which the outer walls of the houses built along the perimeter of the settlement seem to have been their only defense. And for example, we see here Megiddo 5a, 4b. Sometimes during the Iron Age II, many of the cities and towns of the previous phase witnessed extensive changes in almost every aspect of their material culture. Their fortifications became more massive and included the early appearance of highly sophisticated and impressive water systems, city gates, and other features of Iron Age II fortifications, such as Megiddo 4a. The tremendous effort and manpower invested in these systems points beyond any doubt that they were built in order to provide the people inside the walls with physical protection against military attacks. Interestingly, the various types of Iron Age water systems, both in Israel and in Judah, were original local innovations. They were unparalleled in contemporary neighboring kingdoms. These sophisticated water projects were now incorporated in the Iron Age fortifications, and we will see some examples such as Chatzor, in Chatzor again, and in Megiddo, and this is Gezer, and Beersheba. These are among many others. Together with the store buildings, found in almost all of these cities, it is implied that the principal goal of the elaborated fortifications was to withstand prolonged siege. This paper regards two aspects of this phenomenon. The first, what was the reason for these fortifications? What threats were they meant to face? In other words, who was the enemy at the gates? The second aspect, what was the period when these fortification systems were inaugurated? The question of chronology is clearly tied to the question of early urbanism in monarchic Israel, which in recent years has become the focus of a fierce controversy. Despite of the many excavations and new archaeological data available today, scholars still disagree on the chronology of the Iron Age. This controversy has to do with a much broader picture concerning the actual historicity of early statehood, central authority, and political entity in Iron Age Israel. The question of early urbanism and the date that should be assigned to the fortifications is open to speculations. If the alternative, low chronology, is adopted, then early Iron Age II Israel loses most of its urban attributes, including fortification systems. In fact, it would push the emergence of the Iron Age cities of the early Iron Age II about a century later and turn the 10th century BCE into the last phase of the Iron Age. If this is the case, then the earliest Iron Age cities must be lowered in date to the 9th century BCE. In certain cities, the adoption of low chronology pushes the date of the elaborated fortification system to the second half of the 9th century or even later. Obviously, this dating has far-reaching implications for the history of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Our discussion of the dating of the fortification systems carries, therefore, important consequences for this focal debate over the chronology of the Iron Age. We will start by trying to identify the enemy. Despite the controversy over the chronology of the Iron Age, it is generally accepted by both the low and high chronology advocates that most of the early cities, along with their fortification systems, were built sometimes in the 9th century, with the possibility that few were built earlier, sometime at the close of the 10th century BCE. Given the general dating of the 9th century, it appears that the candidates for the possible threat over the young political entity, Israel, could be one of two, and we've heard that before, the Assyrians or the Arameans. In his monumental work on the art of warfare in biblical lands in the early 1960s, Yadin has laid the foundation to an understanding of the concept of fortifications in the land of Israel in the monarchic period. He linked the change in type of city walls with the appearance of the Aramean threat in the local scene, and more particularly with the Assyrian battering ram. However, the archaeological data accumulated over the past 45 years has shown that different fortification systems function simultaneously during various times of the Iron Age. Today, it is well agreed upon that some of the fortification systems clearly antedate the appearance of the effective battering ram in our region. Even if the fortification systems were not built with the Assyrian battering rams in mind, the idea that the massive, elaborated fortification systems of the 9th century were intended to withstand the Assyrian threat is still maintained. Moreover, despite the fact that the biblical account of the Omride dynasty makes no mention of the threat from Assyria, the westward advance of the Assyrian Empire from its Mesopotamian heartland in the 9th century is still considered by many as a looming threat on the kingdom of Israel in the first half of the 9th century. Yet, looking at all the current local inscriptions written during the 9th century and the first half of the 8th that have reached us, the concept of the Assyrians which emerges is quite similar to the biblical one. Even the kings who were definitely involved with the Assyrians rarely mention them in their own inscriptions, and they ignore the Assyrian threat altogether. It is apparent that according to the worldview of the local kings, the enemies were the next-door neighbors. Let us briefly review some of the prominent local actors and their words. Kilamua, king of Samal, a North Syrian kingdom during the second half of the 9th century, describes a dire situation in which his father was the victim of aggressive behavior of neighboring kingdoms. Kilamua himself was harassed by the king of the Danunites. Kilamua reacted by hiring the king of Ashur, bragging what a good deal he got. A young woman was given for a sheep and a young man for a garment. According to the monolith inscription, Kilamua's father, Chayani, son of Gabara, brought tribute to Shalmaneser III in 853. The Samalian point of view does not recognize the faraway Assyrian army as a threat, even after the many campaigns of Shalmaneser to the west in the 50s and 40s of the 9th century. It is one's neighbor who posed a threat. A second example is in the only surviving stele of Hazael, king of Aram, his victory stele from Tel Dan. This king, too, says nothing of his confrontation with Shalmaneser, king of Ashur, in 841 or later. It is his victories against local kings, and in particular the kings of Israel and of Judah, that he mentions in the part of the stele that had survived and reached us. Another prominent example is the evidence of Zakur, king of Hamat, who was already mentioned here today, who described his miraculous rescue at the last minute from a coalition of 16 local kings, headed by Bar-Hadad from Damascus. From inscriptions of Adad-Nerari, king of Ashur, we know that Zakur was involved in the Assyrian advances in the area. It may indeed be true that the attack of Bar-Hadad and his allies against Zakur was intended to force an anti-Assyrian policy in Hamat, as suggested by Nadav Naaman, and that the rescue was brought about thanks to the interference of Adad-Nerari. But Zakur's own inscription does not mention the Assyrians at all. Zakur acknowledges only the local threat. We may mention one more local king who was definitely involved with the Assyrian forces. In the Pazarchik stele, an Assyrian boundary stone relating to the military campaign to the west of Adad-Nerari, king of Ashur, in 805, the campaign is portrayed as induced by the king of Kumuch. The king of Kumuch uses Assyrian forces to his benefit, and as a result expands his territory at the expense of his neighbors. The biblical point of view matches this local perception. Biblical writers did not record the existence of the Neo-Assyrian Empire or recognized its threat till the days of Tiglath-Pileser III. There is no mention of Ahab's participation in the Battle of Karkar in 853 or of his son's probable involvement in the ensuing battles of the coalition of 12 kings against Shalmaneser. Nor is Yehu's tribute in 841 to that king mentioned, or Joash's to Adad-Nerari in 796. The first Assyrian king mentioned in the Deuteronomistic history is Tiglath-Pileser III. Even for the prophet Amos, who was active in the northern kingdom around 760 BCE, the historical enemies were Aram and other neighbors. Amos does not mention the Assyrian enemy even once. When the Assyrians are finally mentioned in the Deuteronomistic history, they are not presented as the terrifying enemy at first, but rather as a tool employed in local power struggle. When Pul, otherwise known as Tiglath-Pileser, came against the land, 2 Kings 15:19 states, and Menachem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to confirm the kingdom in his hand. The same viewpoint is apparent in the description of the submission of Achaz, king of Judah, to Tiglath-Pileser. The Bible portrays the Syro-Ephraimite campaign of Rezin, king of Aram, and Pekach, king of Israel, as the major danger to Achaz. Here too, Nadav Naaman suggested that the reason for the attack was to force Judah to join the anti-Assyrian coalition. But none of this is indicated in the biblical story, not even in the reference to the event in the book of Isaiah. In trouble, Achaz pays Tiglath-Pileser, and that is why Assyria attacked Aram. The king of Assyria responded to his request. The king of Assyria went up to Damascus and captured it, and deported the people of it to Kir, and slew Rezin. Same as Kilamua, king of Samal, and Ushpilulume, king of Kumuch, the biblical point of view is that the local king utilized the Assyrian army by bribing the king and gaining his support in a power struggle between himself and his peers, the next door threatening neighbors. The historiosophic concept of the threatening neighbor, blind to the larger course of events, which will lead eventually to the destruction and demise of Israel, is especially interesting as it is apparent even in compositions which were finally edited after the fall of both Israel and Judah by world powers. Biblical authors offered a religious cause to the unfortunate affairs. Their point of view clings to the fixated idea that the next-door neighbor was the enemy, at least until Tiglath-Pileser destroys northern Israel and deports its population. This reflects, as we saw, the common conception of the kingdoms in that period. Created after the demise of the world powers of the second millennium, local kingdoms had no experience of world empires and could not envision this development in the future until it was too late. Their experience was based on the threat of neighboring kingdoms, their competitors and enemies. This was true even after the campaigns to the west of Shalmaneser III or Adad-Nirari III. If the Bible refers to the Assyrians at this stage, it is in a veiled allusion, marginalizing Adad-Nirari as the enigmatic deliverer in the days of Joash, who was sent by God to help Israel gain their freedom from Aram, the real enemy. The achievements of Shalmaneser and Adad-Nirari had not lasted long enough or left a strong impression to change the local worldview. In light of the above evidence, our conclusion is that the fortifications were directed against the Aramean threat and not the Assyrian. We will now try to establish the most probable chronological setting for the initiation of the system. It is accepted that they belong to the 9th century, yet opinions differ whether in the first half, as was accepted so far, or in the second half of the 9th century, or even slightly later, as suggested recently by advocates of the low chronology. A prerequisite for the building of the system is the existence of resources and political strength in Israel to enable such an enterprise. Indeed, the Bible attributes building activities to Achav. His vassal, Mesha, king of Moab, in his detailed reports, refers to various building activities of his own, among them water projects. Although we cannot be certain as to the exact nature of his building activities, these Moabite projects were built by a kingdom which was subjugated to Israel during the first half of the 9th century, after freeing itself from the Israelite yoke. We may therefore safely assume that Omride Israel was no less capable of similar projects. While the Aramean army posed a threat during the entire 9th century, sufficient resources and political strength existed in Israel only during the first half of that century. In the second half of the 9th century, Israel lost its holding in Moab and was subordinate to Aram. It is unlikely that Aram would have permitted Israel to build fortifications of this order, even if Israel could muster the necessary resources for such an ambitious project at this time. This evaluation rests first of all on the biblical description of the times of Yehu and Yoachaz, which portrays a distressed Israel totally subjugated to Aram with a small and weak army. Thus, according to the Deuteronomistic history, which had no reason to link distress to Yehu, who rooted out the Baal cult, as well as from the perspective of Amos, some 40 years later, who remembers the unceasing Aramean pressure of the inhabitants of the Gilad. This reconstruction is corroborated by archaeology. Tel Dan was taken by Hazael, who erected a victory stele in it. The expansion of Aram to Gat is apparent in the excavations of Aaron Meyer of Tel Safi, as we heard today, and this was beautifully illustrated. The inscription of Zakur, king of Hamat, is a testimony to Aram being the local ringleader. Thus, the position of Israel as a weak, inferior state under the Aramean dominion during the second half of the 9th century does not render likely the possibility that this was the time when the fortification system was initiated and executed. The Arameans were a significant power in the first half of the 9th century as well. Aram headed the anti-Assyrian coalition and withstood alone an Assyrian attack in 841. Although most commentators agree that the stories about the 3 battles of Achav with Ben-Hadad reflect events more relevant to the days of the dynasty of Yehu during the days of Yoachaz and Joash, it is more than likely that the Arameans exercised their power against Israel during Achab's rule as well. While the details of the battle at Samaria, the one at Afek, and the last confrontation at Ramot Gilad where Achab was said to have died, are likely anachronistic. The historiographic notion is correct and fits well with what we know about the political and economical situation. The two kingdoms, Aram and Israel, competed over the supremacy in the area and over the control of the lucrative trade passing through Transjordan and Gilad. Even though Achab was the partner of Hadadezer in the Battle of Karkar at 853, this does not rule out the most probable possibility that the two were enemies during some of the former 22 years of Achab's rule. This was the case in the days of his son, Yoram. He probably continued to send forces to the coalition of 12 kings facing Ashur, as Shalmaneser mentions his clashes with them again in 849, 848, and 845. On the other hand, Hazael, king of Aram, testified in the Tel Dan stele to his bitter struggle against Israel and Judah, which resulted in the death of the two kings, Yoram, king of Israel, and Achaziah, king of Judah. In his inscription, Hazael mentions a former attack of the Israelite king against his father's land, in line 4. Notwithstanding the question, who exactly was Hazael's father if he was an usurper, this is a valid indication of Israeli-Aramean hostilities prior to Hazael. The military abilities of Aram are well documented from the second half of the 9th century, especially in siege warfare. They had built a siege wall in Gat, the only one of its kind found in excavations today, and again I'm repeating what we heard from Aaron Meyer. And Zakur relates the military means of the coalition headed by Baradad, son of Hazael, to conquer the besieged capital city Hadrach. They had built a siege wall higher than the city's wall and dug a trench deeper than the city's trench. In the two biblical stories of an Aramean siege of Samaria, one in the days of Achab in 1 Kings 20, and one in the days of his son Yoram in 2 Kings 6-7, the biblical author attributed great military powers to Aram. It is especially significant to note the long-term siege in the days of Yoram. While the story does not state how long this siege lasted, it says that it brought about a great famine, accompanied with the two classic literary indications of extreme hunger, increase of prices of food, and cannibalism, women eating their own children. We may thus conclude that the Arameans were a threat during the Omride dynasty, but had managed to realize their potential in the full during the days of Hazael in the second half of the 9th century. In sum, the phenomenon of elaborated fortifications appearing in Israel and Judah was created against the Aramean threat. The developed phase of fortifications was created in a time of economic and political strength to answer the threat posed by the expansion policy of Aram. It was created during the Omride dynasty in the first half of the 9th century and not during the reign of Yehu and Yoachaz in the second half, when Israel was weak and subjugated to Aram. This reconstruction bears important consequences on the current debate on chronology of the Iron Age too. Since the elaborate fortification system were initiated during the first half of the 9th century, the urbanization process which preceded this developed stage of the appearance of fortification systems must have begun in the days prior to the Omride dynasty, namely in the 10th century or early 9th century at the latest. We thus suggest that forthcoming discussions of chronology address the issue of the enemy at the gates. Thank you.
We have a few minutes left before we conclude, and Dr. Wazana, Dr. Ben-Ami would be glad to take questions on the last paper. Or, yes, please.
Question about the two triangles on the jar handle. Anybody wants to relate that to Gilmore's article on the Asherah found in the city of David?
This is a question for you. The two triangles.
I didn't catch the second sentence.
There's a recent article by Garth Gilmore about the two triangles found in the city of David.
Yeah, I read it, yes.
Related to Asherah.
Yeah.
Is there a relationship?
No. No, it's not exactly the same.
It's very different.
Was there another hand that we saw there? Well, I think that we certainly this afternoon have gotten a very good picture of the 9th century and the Arameans, both in the first half and the second half of the century. And I thank you all, and especially our speakers, for their contributions.